Good morning, everyone. So good to be here with you at the family at Palm Springs Drive, where we worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost, all to God's glory. So good to be here with you. If you're visiting, we're especially grateful to have you with us this morning. Before our sermons, Adam and I, we try to give you a little evangelism reminder and encouragement. And the reason that we're doing that, I just want to make clear, is that we want evangelism to just become a part of our culture here. Evangelism many times becomes something that we only do once a quarter after the quarterly sermon on evangelism. and we don't want that to happen. We want it to just be a part of the culture here. So really the challenge today for us to think about this week is just to have a paradigm shift, that evangelism is not just something we do, it's something that we are. I'm just a person who tries my best in whatever feeble, small way to point people in Jesus' direction, to help someone take a step in Jesus' direction, no matter how small. That's what the kind of people that we just want to be as part of who we are as Christians. Well, we're in Luke chapter 12. Really excited to get into this parable with you. Do want to apologize in advance for the distracting red spot on my face. I was in an airsoft BB gun battle yesterday, and Ty Willingham shot me in the face. And someone else shot me like an inch above that same spot, and I'm not 100% sure who it was still. I think it was Noah. So those boys, they will be required to come forward after the sermon for shooting the preacher. That is a no-no. Luke chapter 12, we're going to get into our text as we talk about investing in eternity. Let's read this together. Just such an amazing section of Scripture. Verse 13 of Luke 12, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And then he said to them, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' And then he said, 'This is what I will do. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" In this parable, Jesus describes a man who would have made a great American. He was a hard worker. His hard work paid off. He gave himself credit. He was proud of his accomplishments. He was a smart investor, and he knew he had to take care of his future. So he built these larger barns as his own personal IRA, and then he died, and none of it mattered. Because as rich as he was in this earthly life, he was eternally bankrupt. He was rich in grain, but broke in God. And Jesus says this man should have invested in eternity. You know, he had an IRA, he had an individual retirement account, but what he needed far more was to invest in an ERA, an eternal retirement account. He needed to be rich in God. And later in this chapter, Jesus actually describes what it looks like to be rich in God. Look in verse 33 of the same chapter. He says, "Sell your possessions," verse 33, "and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts, which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes, nor moth destroys." Eternity is the place we can put our money so that it will never run out. IRAs, they can run out. IRAs can be wiped out by horrendous downturns in the economy. IRAs don't protect us after we die. But ERAs provide an unfailing treasure. It's like having a wallet with no bottom, and you just keep reaching in, and you can pull out as much as you want. And even after we die, the treasure remains. Now, I'll just give you a heads up. I'm not anti-IRA. We're going to be talking about the need to save money, and that's a good thing. And of course, this is figurative language here that Jesus is using to describe an eternal reward. It's not that we will literally have money in heaven. One man thought that was the case. The story goes that he decided to put in his will that he wanted to be buried with several suitcases full of gold. Gold bricks, actually, so that he could be rich in heaven. Well, he dies, and as he stands before God on the day of judgment with those gold-filled suitcases, God looks at him and asks, "Why did you bring pavement with you?" Our earthly money is worthless in heaven. To help you with that joke, our gold bricks are worthless in a city with streets of gold. And even the streets of gold description in the Bible is just figurative to describe the grandeur and glory of eternity with God. So if we want to invest in eternity, it's not going to be about bringing our earthly treasures with us to heaven, but using our earthly treasures while we are here in a way that brings God honor and glory. In short, to invest in eternity, use God's money God's way. To invest in eternity, use God's money God's way. In order to do that, it's going to begin with the realization that it's God's money, not mine. In our text in Luke 12, Jesus warns these brothers about greed because they both have the attitude that this inheritance is mine. It belongs to me. You know, the older brother is the one in their culture who would be responsible for dividing the inheritance after the death of his father, but he's refusing to share it with his younger brother. We're not really necessarily told why he's refusing to share it, but Jesus talks to both of them about greed, so probably it's just because it's mine. And the younger brother who wanted it divided was angry that his older brother was not giving him a piece of what was rightfully mine. And this kind of thinking is especially highlighted in the parable of the rich man. Look again at the language in verses 17 through 19 of Luke 12. And what I want you to do is, as we read this again, look for the words I and my. Verse 17, he began reasoning to himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?" And then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." I think it's something like 8 I's and 4 my's in 3 verses. He thinks everything that he owns belongs to him. It's mine, my grain, my barns, my goods. He even, get this, believes that his soul belongs to him. That is, until the true owner of his soul and all his possessions shows up to interrupt his little party and take it all away from him. And let's think about what's so wrong with his attitude. Look again in verse 16. It says the land of a rich man was very productive. I don't question this man's productivity, but he may have worked very hard. But here's my question. In the world of agriculture, what is the true key to a productive land? It's rain. It's rain. Rain was everything in the ancient world. It was the key to survival, the key to their land flourishing. So here's my next question. What did this rich man do to make it rain on his land? Absolutely nothing. Even under the law of Moses, when God brought the Israelites into the land of Canaan, he told them this. He says in Deuteronomy 11 and verse 14 that one of the blessings he was going to provide them is rain. He, that is God, will give the rain for your land in its season, the early and the late rain, that you may gather in your grain, in your new wine, in your oil. And one of the curses for disobeying God, he said, is that I will shut up the heavens and there will be no rain in your land. This rich man is so prideful because he thinks he made this wealth by his own power, when in reality it was a blessing from the Lord. God even warned the Israelites when they went into the land of Canaan not to become prideful and to forget who gave them their blessings. He says this in Deuteronomy 8:17-18, "Otherwise you may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth, that He may confirm His covenant, which He swore to your fathers as it is to this day." We might make a lot of money in this life, but how can we make money without our health? God is the one who sustains our health. We might make a lot of money in this life, but how can we make money without our breath, without life? God sustains our life. How can we do it without the energy from food? Who provides the food? Well, it's the Lord. How can we make money without talents and skills? Who created us with brains, with the capacity to learn talents and skills? Who created us with inborn talents that then we could grow up to discover and hone and use to make a living? It all comes from God. Even the paper we use to print our money on comes from God's trees. Psalm 24, verse 1. "The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it." In order to handle money well and invest in eternity, it has to start with the understanding that everything we have belongs to God. It is not really our money, it is His money. That's why there are so many scriptures about stewardship. We just talked about one this morning, later in this very chapter, how God is putting us in charge of His household. He's the master, we're the servant, and we're put in charge of other servants and possessions. And I know that had special application to the disciples, but think about the parable of the talents as well. There's another stewardship type lesson that God entrusts us with managing part of His world. He entrusts us with managing part of His possessions, and He expects us to manage His household well. And here's why that's so practical. It means that our main question will be, what does God want me to do with His money? And not, what do I want to do with my money? I know some of you babysit for each other on occasion. I just think that's wonderful that you do that. And I know that the parents, they leave you detailed instructions about what to do and what not to do and what to feed their kids and when to feed their kids and when to put them to bed and all that. Well, when you're babysitting, I don't think that you have ever said, well, you know what? I know the parents said to put their kids down for bed at 7, but I'm just having so much fun. And these kids are just so enjoyable. They bring me so much joy. I'm going to let them stay up till midnight. We can just watch movies together. And if they start to get a little too tired, I'll just pump them with candy and they'll be right back energetic again. Because I just enjoy them so much. We wouldn't do that. We would respect the wishes of the parents because those are their kids. We would never say, these are my kids and I'll do whatever I want with them. They are not our kids. They are someone else's. And yet sometimes we treat money like that. It's my money and it brings me so much joy. I'll just do what I want with it. But it's not really our money at all. It's God's money. He has entrusted this money to us to be handled and managed well. And He has left us instructions in His Word for His money, just like parents do for their kids' babysitters. It's been said there are 3 main attitudes about money. The first attitude is what's yours is mine, and I'll take it. That's the attitude of these 2 brothers fighting over this inheritance. And it's the attitude, sadly, and I'm speaking to the young people especially because you're going to just start to notice this more and more as you listen to political debates and discussions. There's an attitude that is really becoming prevalent in our society today, that anybody who is rich is an evil villain who only got rich by taking advantage of the poor, and therefore the money that the rich people have, that's not really their money. It belongs to us, and we are going to take it from them. That is an attitude rooted in greed. Secondly, what's mine is mine, and I'll keep it. That's the attitude of the rich man in this parable. And sadly, it's an attitude of a lot of people today living the American dream, because I earned it and I'll do what I decide to do with my money, and I may or may not feel like giving some of it away. And if I do, great. If not, hey, that's up to me. I'll just do whatever I feel like doing. It's an attitude rooted in greed. And thirdly, what's mine is God's, and I'll use it. This is the attitude Jesus wants us to have. To use God's money for God's glory. That's what it means to invest in eternity, so that we can be rich in God and have an unfailing treasure in heaven. It's God's money, not mine. Secondly, God's money should be shared, not just stored. And the word, again, just, is very important there, because there's nothing wrong with storing money. There's nothing wrong with saving money. What's wrong is when we think all we're supposed to do with money is store it. Jesus says there in verse 15 that we need to be on guard against every form of greed. Why? Because not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. Life is not about accumulating wealth. But that's what these brothers are acting like. In fact, this younger brother, he's kind of like the darker evil twin to Martha. If you remember Adam's sermon last week, we talked about Luke 10, where Martha is working to prepare a meal for Jesus. And Jesus looks at her and says, you are worried and you are bothered about so many things, but there's only one thing that's necessary, and your sister Mary, she's chosen the good part. Well, here in Luke 12, this brother is also worried and bothered about things that just don't matter when compared to sitting at Jesus' feet. Think about it. They have the Lord and Savior standing right there in their midst. And their brilliant idea is, well, I'm going to use Jesus to solve a money dispute. And just like Martha, who was frustrated with Jesus and told Jesus, tell Mary to help me, this guy's frustrated and he tells Jesus, tell my brother to divide this inheritance with me. His obsession with this inheritance is taking him to a dark place where he can't even see Jesus for who he is. At least Martha was trying to do something good. But this man's greedy desire for money is taking him nowhere good. 1 Timothy 6, verses 9 and 10, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Money is not evil. Money is not the problem. It's the love of money. It's the longing for money, longing to accumulate more and to store up more that always ends in grief. And this parable Jesus tells is tremendously sad. The rich man seems to not have any friends or family at all that he's thinking about. In fact, some believe the wording in verse 16 indicates that he was already rich before his land became productive. And so what he's storing up now is really just a surplus on top of the riches that he already had. And he's just storing up more. But for whose benefit? The text says it's for himself. And God's question in verse 20 to this man, who will own what you have prepared, seems to indicate he hasn't even made plans to leave it for an inheritance to anyone else after him either. Once he dies, he has no idea who is going to get this grain, because he wasn't thinking about anyone else but himself and how much wealth he could store up. What a sad and empty life. And when we understand God's money is meant to be shared, not just stored, there would be three benefits to that. Number one, we won't be so anxious about money. I believe this is why the next section on anxiety falls right on the heels of the warning about greed. He says in verse 22, for this reason I say to you, do not worry about your life as to what you will eat, nor for your body as to what you will put on. When we are obsessed with accumulating money, we'll be constantly worried that we haven't stored enough. Our mood and our faith will rise and fall with the rise and fall of our bank balance. Our mood and our faith will rise and fall with the ebb and flow of election cycles and interest rates and economic forecasts. But when our goal isn't just money storage, and we know that money is meant to be shared, we'll trust God more to provide for us for the basic needs and also to provide money for us to share with others, because that's His purpose for our life. Secondly, we won't depend on money for happiness. Michael Norton is a Harvard Business School professor who has done extensive research on the connection between wealth and happiness. And in one study, his team asked 2,000 people with at least a $1 million net worth how happy they were on a scale of 1 to 10. And then to answer the question, how much more money would you need in order to get to that perfect 10 level? Norton said this, quote, "Basically everyone, no matter where they were on the wealth scale, told us they would need 2 or 3 times as much as they had to be perfectly happy." Accumulating money is not the source of joy. One of the most famous rich people of all time, Andrew Carnegie, he once said, "Millionaires who laugh are rare." The more money we make, the more our expenses go up, the more responsibilities we have, the more pressure there is not to lose it. It doesn't do much to help our relationships. In fact, we can't even trust whether the relationships are genuine or if those people are just our friends for our money. Many times money can actually hinder and hurt our relationship, and money just seems like it disappears so easily. Proverbs 23, verses 4 and 5, "Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eyes on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings like an eagle that flies toward the heaven." Can we remind ourselves who said that? That's Solomon, one of the richest men to ever live, is saying this. He knows this from experience. It just disappears. It just goes away. There was a bumper sticker that said, "Money does talk, but mine only ever says goodbye." If we're relying on money to make us happy and satisfied in life, it'll never happen. Only God, who blesses us with money, can give us true joy and satisfaction. Proverbs 10:22, "It is the blessing of the Lord that makes rich, and He adds no sorrow to it." The sorrow with money comes when we're chasing money to make us happy. That just makes us sorrowful and feel empty. And also when we believe that money is what makes us happy, we'll sink to sinful levels to get it. And that leads to consequences that also bring sorrow. It's not the money that brings the joy. It's having the blessing of God behind the money that He has given us. And that's only possible when we are willing to realize it's His money to be shared, not just hoarded and stored. And of course, a third benefit here is that we'll be more generous. If we think life is about storing money, we won't let it go. We'll hold on to it for dear life and try to keep money from slipping away. But when we understand God's money is meant to be shared and not just stored, we'll use it for that purpose. And what we will find is that God will usually bless us for that generosity with generosity in return. Now, I need to be very careful with this point because the motivation for being generous is not so that God will then give us money back in return. That's not the motivation. But in both the Old and the New Testaments, it is absolutely and abundantly clear that God rewards us when we share His money. And it's those who hoard it to their own hurt that end up losing it all, like the rich man in this parable. How about this verse for you? Proverbs 19:17, "One who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. What an amazing concept. To think that we can actually lend to the Lord when he already owns it all. But he's making this point that when we are generous and we give to people in need, God will pay us back for that. And I think maybe the implication too is with interest. We're doing God a favor in that sense by giving money to people. It's a weird thought, and we need to be careful being too literal with it. It's supposed to paint a picture. It is a general principle. It's not literally, well, if I give someone $20 today, well, then tomorrow I'm going to get $25 in the mail or something like that. That's not the point. But has stuff like that ever happened to you? It has happened to me a lot. Almost every time I let God's money go and I share it with somebody, somehow it comes back to me. I don't understand it. It's inexplicable, and I've talked to other people who have had the same thing happen to them. And even if it doesn't necessarily come back to you in this life, the point is it'll come back to you in eternity. It's ultimately what it means to invest in eternity. I'll give you an illustration. The story goes that a Christian man, he went to go see a financial planner who he did not realize was also a Christian. Well, he was so impressed with this financial planner and his presentations and his charts and his knowledge about the stock market and what accounts to use and interest rates and all that. And anytime he had a question for the financial planner, he just always seemed like he had the answer. Well, toward the end of this meeting, this man decided he wanted to try to stump his financial advisor and give him a question that he would really have to wrestle with. And so he said to him, I appreciate everything you've done to help me with my earthly investments, but how do I use my money to invest in eternity? And without missing a beat, the financial planner said, well, the Bible makes it pretty clear. Invest your money in people, not just portfolios. That's well said, if my clicker will bring it up. He's saying to share, not just store. That's what it means to use God's money God's way. To share it with people who do not have as much as we do. And when we do that, God will give us an eternal return on investment. I can show you this in the New Testament. 1 Timothy 6, 18 and 19. Notice he doesn't say, instruct the rich to not be rich anymore. And make sure to give literally all the riches away because you have to be poor in order to be a Christian. That's not what he says. He says, instruct the rich to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life. Indeed, God's money is meant to be shared, not just stored. And thirdly, God's money should be managed God's way. The rich man in our parable, he managed his money, but he didn't manage it God's way, so he got zero eternal return on his investment. And I want to leave you with 6 steps to godly money management so that we can invest in eternity. And these are things that as parents, you can begin teaching your children even at an early age. Number 1, work hard. Greed often looks for get-rich-quick schemes and handouts to avoid work. This brother who came to Jesus, he may have thought this inheritance was his ticket to a life of ease and pleasure. That's what the rich man saw his situation as, an opportunity for him to just take it easy now and never have to work again. Proverbs 10 verse 4 says, poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. The godly way to make money is good old-fashioned hard work. The famous financial advisor Dave Ramsey says he worked as hard as he could for 25 years and then became an overnight success. And let me throw this point in as well, because I know in our information age especially, there is a way to make money many times without doing as much work. In fact, you'll often hear the phrase, work smarter, not harder. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. And maybe you end up making so much money at an early age that you don't have to work anymore. Maybe we don't know the age of this rich young man. He could be young, he could be old. But maybe you're a young man and you're rich because you had a clever way to make a bunch of money and now you don't have to necessarily go into work anymore. Or maybe you worked hard your whole life and now, hey, you can retire. Here's my encouragement to you. Keep working as much as you are able in God's kingdom because God is still paying you. Secondly, live below your means. Proverbs 13:7. I love this verse. So true. There is one who pretends to be rich, but has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, but has great wealth. There's a book called The Millionaire Next Door, and the premise of the book is right there in the title. And one of the major premises is that many times the wealthiest people, they don't look wealthy at all. They aren't necessarily in these huge, fancy houses out in Beverly Hills. They don't necessarily drive the fanciest cars. They live right next door. And ironically, many of the people who have the flashiest lifestyle, who look like they're just the wealthiest people in the world, are actually broke because they're living on borrowed money. Instead of living below their means, they have bought a life they can't afford, and their entire life is really balancing on a house of credit cards that could tumble at any time. God's way of managing money means not spending more than we make. And what that means is we're going to need a budget to help us see exactly what we're spending our money on, where our money is going. It means that we're going to need self-control to resist the siren song of the monthly payment plan. It is so seductive and so destructive if not handled wisely. And it's going to mean we need contentment with what we have. Thirdly, give cheerfully to the Lord. I understand we are not under the Old Testament tithing system, but just in principle, when we understand it is God who blesses us with our wealth, gives us the ability to work and earn money, it's only natural we would honor the Lord first with our money. I'm using the Proverbs a lot, even though we're Christians, we're not under the Old Testament law anymore, but the Proverbs give us timeless principles for wise living. And they talk so much about money. In fact, you'd be amazed how much the Bible as a whole, Old and New Testament, talk about money. It is such an important subject that we make sure that we use wisdom about. He says in Proverbs 3, 9, and 10, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. It's not a health and wealth gospel. I give God money and He gives me $10,000 back. That's not the point. The point is that God rewards those who put Him first and honor Him with their wealth. Even in the New Testament, He says each one must do as he has purpose in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The rich man in Jesus' parable, he didn't want to give anything to the Lord. He took all the credit, so He took all the crops. And that's how it works. If we give the Lord credit, we're going to give Him from our produce and from our wealth. And a great opportunity, of course, is to do that every Sunday morning when the collection plate comes around. Fourthly, support and save for our families. It doesn't sound to me like this older brother was looking out for his younger brother at all. Rather than helping his family, it sounds like he's kind of hoarding the inheritance for himself. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his household, he's denied the faith. He's worse than an unbeliever. Second to the Lord, our primary obligation with our money is to our own families. And part of supporting our families isn't just working hard to make money for their present well-being, but also for their future well-being. Proverbs 13:22a, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. I read a recent statistic that 69% of Americans have less than $1,000 in their savings account. Now, I realize there are different reasons for that. But it shows in general that saving money is not a big priority for people. And that's just not wise. And this is where it is helpful to meet with a financial planner. It is helpful to invest in the IRA or the 401k or all the other relevant acronyms. because investing in eternity is about investing in people. And the most important people God has put in our lives is, first and foremost, our family members that we are to support and to provide for their future and present well-being. The Lord is pleased when we use our money to do that. Fifth, share generously with our brethren and then with anyone in need. Galatians 6 in verse 10 says, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. Helping people in need, it's not just a suggestion in the Bible, it's a command. And it's an expectation of what it means to be a steward of God's money. And it is indeed more blessed to give than to receive. And finally, enjoy the blessings of God's money. And I know this is the end of the sermon, but I really want y'all to stick with me. And I'm going to give you something very challenging in a second. Because this is the part Christians can really feel guilty about. And honestly, it's the part Christians can become really judgmental of other Christians about. But the Bible teaches us that God gives us our jobs and He gives us our wealth as a blessing and a reward to enjoy in this sin-cursed world. Oh, I'll give you Old Testament and New. Ecclesiastes 5, Old Testament, 18 and 19. Here is what I have seen to be fitting, to eat, drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. And as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, He has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. God is happy with us, enjoying the blessings He's given us. It's part of our reprieve in this fallen, broken world. New Testament, 1 Timothy 6, we read verses 18 and 19 earlier. Here's the one right before it. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. He does say in the next verse, be ready to share, be generous, but he also says to enjoy the blessings that He has given us. And of course, this will be a struggle in our consciences to determine, okay, I hear you on that, preacher, but how much of my money am I supposed to use for enjoyment? You know, what's the percentage here? Well, when determining this, I think it's really a matter of three things. Number one, priorities. Number two, spending ratios or percentages. And three, personal conscience. Because God actually doesn't give us that percentage. He wants us, I think, to wrestle with this concept. It would be easy if He said, well, let's just give 10% and all right, there you go, I'll do it. But He wants us to wrestle with how much to give Him, how much to share with others, and how much to enjoy with our finances. And I think it's pretty fair. If we're using 90% of our money on our own enjoyment, our priorities are mixed up. I think that's a pretty fair statement. But also this is based on spending ratios, meaning how much we spend compared to what we make, because we are all at different income levels, different levels of wealth. Let me give you a really challenging real-life example. And this may test your heart. I still wrestle with it in my head a little bit. I want you to really reflect on this. Dave Ramsey, in one of his books, he said that he had a Christian friend. And this Christian friend of his had a $2 billion net worth. And when he was visiting his friend, I guess they were going to go out to eat or something like that, and his friend was embarrassed because he had just bought himself a $130,000 Mercedes. And he's almost ashamed of this. And come to find out, this man had received hate mail from other people claiming to be Christians and saying things like, well, how much food and water could you have provided for starving people in Africa with that money? But what they didn't know was that this man had given $500 million to help needy people that year. That means he gave away that year not 25% of his income, 25% of his net worth. And I wonder how many people who criticized him for his $130,000 car would be willing to give away 25% of their net worth. Now, of course, someone might respond, yeah, but when you have $2 billion, 25%, well, that's nothing. Well, if you want to play that game, let's play that game. You want to know how much a $130,000 car is to a man with a $2 billion net worth? It is 0.0007% of his net worth. If you want a comparison, that would be like me buying a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Also, if you do the math on the fact that he gave away $500 million that year, it says a lot about his priorities, because it means he gave away 4,000 times as much money than he spent on himself for that car. As long as our priorities are straight, brethren, let's be careful not to look down on ourselves as evil for enjoying the wealth God has blessed us with. And let's be careful not to look down on our brethren who may be doing better than we are financially. Maybe they have nicer houses, nicer cars and clothes. But if we look down on them as if they're just being greedy and self-indulgent, the truth is that attitude comes from greed and jealousy. The very attitude Jesus is condemning in this section in Luke 12. We have no idea how much that brother or sister has given away, and they may be far more generous than we are when we compare the ratios in our budget. They may be richer than we are because God knew they could handle that wealth more than we could handle that wealth. They may be richer than we are because they provide more value and have helped more people in society with their products that they make than we have. To invest in eternity, use God's money, God's way. Would you take out your songbooks, please, if you're going to use one? The language in the Bible, if you're not careful in this study, can almost make it sound like we can buy heaven. I mean, hey, I just invest in people here and God will reward me with heaven. And it's just this very transactional sort of thing with money. Far from it. In fact, money can do nothing to save us and redeem us. If it could, Jesus would have just wrote God a check for us. But what Peter says in 1 Peter 1:18 and 19 is that we were not redeemed with perishable things like silver and gold from the futile ways inherited from our forefathers, but with precious blood, the blood of a lamb, unblemished and spotless. It's a priceless gift that God gave us to redeem us and to save our souls. And He wants you to respond to His salvation and His gift this morning by giving Him your life in belief in baptism, and then living your life and using your money His way for His glory. If you're ready to do that this morning, we're ready to help you. Come forward and let us know how we can help while we stand and sing.